Welcome to everyone to Democracy Winners, and thank you all very much for being here today. My name's Kate Laddish. I'm a member of Democracy Winners Steering Committee and am today's facilitator. And before I officially introduce our speaker, just a quick overview, a little bit more of our group. So we were founded 6 years ago here in Winters. And so Democracy Winners is a nonpartisan organization dedicated to strengthening democracy, protecting constitutional freedoms, and promoting informed engagement in local, state, and national politics. And our newsletter includes previews of meetings such as this morning's, as well as a call of the week, regional opportunities for civic engagement, and more. And if you'd like to join the newsletter list, you can either send me a Zoom chat with your email address or email us at info@democracywinters.org. And I'll also put a link to our sign-up form in the Zoom chat in just a couple minutes. So the first hour of our meetings will feature our guest speakers. And after that, we have 30 minutes to hear from our federal, state, and local issues trackers before we wrap up at noon. And now it is very much, truly my pleasure to introduce farmer, author, and Winters resident Craig McNamara, who will speak with us this morning about his recent memoir, Because Our Fathers Lied, a memoir about truth and family from Vietnam to today. And many of us are lucky to know Craig through his roles as a leader in our community and on the state and national levels on sustainable agriculture. So he's co-founder of Sierra Orchards and founder of the Center for the Land-Based Learning. He served as president of the State Board of Food and Agriculture and as a member of the UC President's Advisory Commission, the Board of the American Farmland Trust, and much more. And awards include the California Governor's Environmental and Economic Leadership Award, the Leopold Conservation Award, the UC Davis Award of Distinction, and Outstanding Alumnus Award. Because Our Fathers Lied is rooted in Craig's relationship with his father, Robert McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. It has received extensive praise, including from former Governor Jerry Brown, filmmaker Ken Burns, Vietnam veteran and author of Born on the 4th of July, Ron Kovac, who said it's an important book an important book that should be read by every American. And I just have to add that Craig, reading this, I mean, it truly engages both the head and the heart. It's a tremendously compelling book, and thank you for writing it. So yeah. Craig will give a 40-minute presentation followed by about 20 minutes of Q&A. And Craig, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Kate, and thank you all. I've just scrolled down, and those of you who I can't see, it's so nice to see that you're here today, and I send you all my best from Winters and from Sierra Orchards. My time together with you really is our time, and the reason I so enjoy being present with you today and have been doing book events since the book was published in May is because it's our journey. So many of us experienced the time frame in which my father served as Secretary of Defense, and we've grappled with the issues of the American War for all of our lives. And it's poignant, it's tragic. Ultimately, we'll talk today a little bit about the lessons that my father came forward with in his memoir that he published in about 1994. He drew 11 lessons, and we'll talk about those. And my point of bringing that up is I don't think that as a nation that we're implementing those lessons. But let me begin where the story begins. I realize that my entire life has been lived through the lens of Vietnam, my entire adult life. I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, born in 1950. My father came home one day in 1960 and said, "Well, Craigie, what do you think about moving to Washington, D.C.?" And I said, "That sounds great for you and Mom. I'm not going. This is where my life is, Ann Arbor. We live next to the Arboretum. Friends are here." Well, everything changed as my mother and father became part of Camelot. And I just want us to pause for a second, because we all lived through that. If you can think of going to Washington, D.C. in 1961 and the desires and the hopes, the vision, the pathway of the 60s, the opportunities, and all of that, I often think of what we experienced Malcolm X was assassinated. Obviously, JFK was assassinated. Bobby was assassinated. MLK was assassinated. Our cities were burning. We were in turmoil, and our nation was in turmoil, and we could not. We lived that, and that was our formative years in growing up. So I hold on to that only to, and I forgot to mention the closeness with which we came to nuclear disaster in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I look at that framework and I think of where we are today. What are the challenges that we are facing today, and what are the similarities and the differences? So we can let's put that in the parking lot for a second to see the challenges that we experienced growing up in the 60s, and what are the challenges that we in this group today face, and what are our children facing? Because our children were the age that we were back in the 60s. So this book began because Julie and I had an opportunity to spend a year at Stanford in 2018. And there's an amazing program that's called the Distinguished Careers Institute. One applies to it, and if accepted, you are a student at Stanford for a year, and you can take any courses in any departments. You can do undergraduate, graduate student study. It's not free. It's expensive. It's the Stanford tuition. But it was one of the most unique learning opportunities of my life, hands down. And I knew going into it that it would be an opportunity for me to devote my thought and time to this book. And one of the beauties of being at Stanford was I took a creative writing course and asked the chair of the department if I could possibly be assigned an independent study lecture. And within a day or two, they assigned me Sarah Frisch, a wonderful Stegner Fellow and lecturer at Stanford. Her husband's a graffiti artist in South San Francisco. They have 2 teenage daughters, and Sarah and I worked on and off for a year and a half. She was kind of both my coach and my in-house editor. And she, being a writer, she knew the trials and tribulations of writing and helped me actually plot, have me put down on butcher block paper an idea of what this book would be. And at that early point, I didn't know that it would be the book that it is. I didn't know that it would be 80% about my relationship with my father, but I realized that that's what I needed to unpack. And so in so doing, I knew that honesty and dishonesty, lies, were at the core of what I was feeling and what I think many of us felt about Robert McNamara's decisions, about the administration's decisions on Vietnam. And I was introduced to a poem by Rudyard Kipling, and the poem is entitled Epitaphs of the War, 1914 to 1918. And it's a lengthy poem, and in the middle of the poem is this quote: "If any question why we died, tell them because our fathers lied." And the backstory is that Rudyard Kipling's son wanted to enlist in World War I. However, he wore glasses and he was not able to do so. So his father went up to the higher ups and was able to ensure that his son would be enlisted. His son went to war. I believe I've learned that his glasses fell off. He was wounded and killed. So the poem is an epitaph. It's expressing the sorrow and the loss that Kipling felt having lied to get his son into World War I. And I just thought it was a very appropriate epitaph for my book, and really told the story of what I feel. And Kate, do you think that many of our people today have been able to read the book? If not, I might just read the epilogue, the prologue, actually, if that would be of interest to people. If people have read the book, then I don't think we should spend the time on that. What do you think?
I know several of us have, but I don't know that everybody's had the chance. And so whatever works best for you. Sounds great.
Okay. Well, I want to really, the most important point of what I would like to do is talk with you all. And when we get to that point, to just engage in a thoughtful conversation. So let me just remind us of the atrocity of Vietnam. And let me just remind us, we know the data points that 58,000 US soldiers were killed in Vietnam. You may know that 2 to 3 million Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodians were also killed, and families and civilians were killed. You may know, you may not know, I didn't until I did the research on the book, that 2.7 million US soldiers served in Vietnam. That's an amazing number. The other thing I didn't know is that 300,000 soldiers of the US were wounded in Vietnam. Another one of the data points that we need to pause on is that we dropped 3 times the amount of bombs during Vietnam than we did during World War II. That's 7.5 million tons of bombs that we dropped. We also applied over 13 million gallons of Agent Orange. And we dropped 380,000 tons of napalm. The reason I mention that is that amount of destructive power not only destroyed so many villages and people's lives, but it destroyed the environment, and it continues to do so to this day. I don't know if any of you all have traveled to Vietnam. My daughter Emily and I did so in 2017, and it was one of the most remarkable trips of my life, to be embraced by the Vietnamese people. And we can talk about the legacy of the American War and what the Vietnamese think about that today. But I think maybe the importance or the takeaway of this book, and it's a journal. I didn't want to make it chronological. I wanted to start in one place and weave in various parts of my journey, and we can talk about that. I think the takeaway is, and I think this is probably true with many of our generation's parents, particularly our fathers, many of whom served in World War II or Korea. My father had an impermeable shield in front of him in terms of my ability to ask him about the Vietnam War. I get that. As a 15-year-old when I was 1965, or a 22-year-old when I was, in 1972 or whatever. But as an adult, it made no sense to me. Why did he choose not to share with me and consequently with our nation his true feelings and thoughts? And I've got a few questions that I'll ask you right now, and I want to answer them as we go forward, but be thinking about them as we move forward. One of them is, when do you think that Robert McNamara realized that the war was not winnable? So be thinking about that as we move forward in our conversation here. And I'll give you a little teaser. During the man who published the 7,000 pages of the Pentagon paper, he was an author. He was not the sole author. Is our internet connection okay? So my father requested that the Pentagon papers be assembled, and Daniel Ellsberg was one of the contributors to that. And as you know, the history, his role in that was very significant. And the reason I mentioned Daniel Ellsberg, Daniel is now 92 years old. He lives in Kensington, which is Berkeley, and his memory and his activism is sharper than all of ours put together. Daniel is a person of such integrity and purpose that he feels so strongly that he would go out on a picket line. He would be arrested today for whatever it is that he feels is right. And his anti-nuclear efforts are very significant to this day. So mention him because I've learned so much from him about the Vietnam War and about Robert McNamara. He and my father were not friends. As a matter of fact, when Daniel was facing 117 years of jail time, in his testimony, he asked Robert McNamara if he would testify on Dan's behalf, and my father said no. One of the things that I was able briefly to talk with my father about it, when he wrote his autobiography in retrospect, was, why couldn't you have done this sooner, Dad? This was 1994, 1995, and begun the process of healing, because in this, he said that he was wrong. Now, he did not go forward and say, I apologize. He did not move forward and embrace veterans to the degree that I feel he should have. He did not move forward as Senator Leahy from Vermont has his entire career, which is to make reparations and find congressional funding to assist with the repairs, to finding munitions in Vietnam unexploded, and ensure that they're found and destroyed, to reduce the toxicity of the Agent Orange and after effects of napalm. Those are the reparations that I wish my father had done in his lifetime, and he could have done them. And I give him credit for saying that he was wrong, because if we look in our lifetimes towards other leaders who have admitted failure, tell me one. Certainly wasn't Henry Kissinger. It's not our presidents. Rarely is it our congressional leaders. So I do give my father credit for that. And I remember walking with my father one evening. My teenage years, and actually he lived and died in DC, were on 2412 Tracy Place, Northwest Washington, DC, one of the neighborhoods in DC near the Rock Creek Park. And we were walking one evening, and I did ask him, why couldn't you have done this earlier? And he said he said something about loyalty. And I said, well, loyalty to who? To whom? And he said, loyalty to the presidents that he served. So I want to pause a second. The friendships, both private and professional, that he and my mother had with President Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy, with Lyndon Baines Johnson and Labor Johnson, were profound. And you can imagine the loss that Robert McNamara experienced, that we all experienced, but the deep loss and friendship that he experienced when the president was assassinated. And I want to pause here for a second and just say, on that day, Friday, November 22nd, 1963, it was 12 o'clock I was in school, in middle school, got the message, went home. And that night we drove in our blue Ford Galaxy to the Bethesda Naval Hospital in the darkness, where the president's body had been taken for the autopsy, but also for Mrs. Kennedy and my father to decide where the burial would be for the president, because Dad was Secretary of Defense. Arlington Cemetery was under his purview. And so what we know today, the eternal flame, that was selected by my father. I only mention that because I want to get back to loyalty. Can you imagine that experience? And then the experience of losing Bobby Kennedy, because my father and mother were extremely close. So, loyalty. In the many visits that I shared with Daniel Ellsberg, he gave me, and maybe I can find it here. He gave me this copy of Life magazine. This is dated May 10th of 1968. And in it is an incredible long interview with my father. It's probably 20 pages of interviews. And in the middle of it is a quote from my father, and I want to read it to you. Quote, around Washington, there is this concept of the higher loyalty. I think it's a heretical concept. This idea that there's a duty to serve the nation above the duty to serve the president, and that you're justified in doing so. It will destroy democracy if it's followed. You have to subordinate a part of yourself, a part of your views, end quote. And I want to just think here a second. My father, like presidents, cabinet ministers, Supreme Court justices, John Garamendi, our electeds all take the same oath of office, which is, I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. It does not say that I will be loyal to the president against my true feelings. So this is my first question of your homework. When do you think that Robert McNamara realized that the Vietnam War was not winnable? I'm going to ask Don Saylor the first question. Don, when do you think my father realized that?
The Tet Offensive, would that be?
I think that's a
time.
So that would be 65-ish, 66. Let me look at when was the Tet Offensive? We got our. I think, can anybody come up with the Tet? The Gulf of Tonkin was 64. I think the Tet Offensive was later, such as
It was later.
Wikipedia says 68.
68. Okay. So any other thoughts as to when you think that my father, privately realized that the war wasn't winnable?
So I think maybe earlier than that. I would guess 65 because things were going south right about then, but it's just a guess, maybe 64 even.
I think you're spot on, Ken. I think, and it's interesting because I had a wonderful opportunity to be at the Davis Friends Meeting House on Thursday night, which was a true, very moving for me. And towards the end of the evening, one of the gentlemen in the far back really pushed me on this, because I think it was 1965. And the reason I think that is from what I've learned through Daniel Ellsberg. And as I will say to you, and I said to them, I'm not a historian. I'm not a journalist. This book is not neither of those. It's not history, nor it's journalism. It's my memoir. So this gentleman really wanted to push me on why, show me the facts, show me the data, show me the quotes. And I couldn't do that. I think Daniel Ellsberg probably can. But that would be the time frame that I'm realizing. And the reason I bring that up, and the reason I think it's so darn important, is if he felt that way, where was his loyalty? Was it not, should it not have been to the mothers and fathers and sons and daughters? Should it not have been to us as citizens who protested the war? Should it not be to the military and to the president? And around that time, I'm thinking more like 66, 67, Bobby Kennedy was coming forward to Robert McNamara and saying, Bob, get us out of Vietnam. It's time to do that, and it's an obligation to do that. Now, I don't know anything about this because I've never talked to my father about it, but you could think that he was standing between the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who probably wanted to go nuclear. Should the aggressions be such that China entered into the war, which I don't think it would have from the history that I've read. Our Joint Chiefs were prepared to go nuclear on that. And no president wants to lose a war. So you can go even back in time and you could say, well, what did John F. Kennedy think? John F. Kennedy probably wanted to get through his first term. I feel fairly for sure that he would have won a second term. And it's my belief, only my belief, that he and McNamara would have gotten us out of the war in the early part of his second term.
Well, Craig, can I just say that I watched Fog of War recently. And there's an exchange, a recorded exchange between your father and President Kennedy about why, winding it down and a time frame for bringing the troops that were already there home.
Right. Well, yes, you're absolutely right. And there's something else. Thank you, Jill, for mentioning that. There's something else very powerful in The Fog of War. And for those of you who may not have seen it, it's a moving documentary. Errol Morris is an amazing filmmaker, and I've won an Oscar for it. It's up on my wall there. McNamara, my dad says at some point that he's talking about World War II. And he said, and he's talking about General Curtis LeMay. And I guess the quote from LeMay is that had the US not won the war, World War II, General LeMay and all of those who supported the war effort would be war criminals. And there's a pause at that moment in the documentary where my father alludes to the fact that maybe that's the case in Vietnam. My conversations with Errol Morris, my follow-up conversations with Errol Morris, and those many that I've had with Daniel Ellsberg, and those with Phil Tubman. Phil and his brother are writing a biography of my father right now, which will be, I think, the most important one of my father's life. All have directed me in the direction that my father was a war criminal. And that was my second question that I was going to ask you for your thought. Is I didn't recognize that when I was writing, but I've come to that conclusion at this point in working on this book. So, Kate, do you think this would be an appropriate time? We've raised some thoughts here and spend the rest of our time together. I can rattle on about certain things. There are a few stories. I don't think I want to read to you because I think our verbal time together is more important than taking time to read. But I would like to, maybe before we have a group conversation, I could share one more story that brings us back to winters. And that is that back to when President Kennedy was assassinated, Jackie Kennedy returned to the White House that night, Friday night, and I can only imagine to her young children, to the gravity of planning a funeral that we all recognize and experience. And at some point, she wanted to give my father something that the president would, a memento that the president would have wanted to give my father for my father's service. And she decided that she would give him his cabinet chair. And those chairs, they're different today, but they still have cabinet chairs, whether you're Secretary of State or Treasury or Defense or Environment. And so she gave him his chair, which is just this beautiful chair, mahogany chair with black leather and a brass document on the back. And she also gave to my father the president's chair. So those two chairs were forever in our living room from 13 years old onward to the time that I was 50 years old. And I just thought that at the time that my dad passed, that those two chairs would be shared by my two sisters and myself. Well, that did not come to pass. My mom died relatively early in this whole journey, and we'd always encouraged my father to remarry. Well, he made that decision at 86-ish. And the person to whom he married was a very difficult, trying person. And without getting into the detail, she was able to assume ownership of all of my father's artifacts, personal, private, the whole thing. So those were all sold at an auction at Sotheby's in New York City on the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis to give the auction just this gravitas. And the chairs were sold for several $100,000. And I was very heartbroken. I mentioned that to a friend of mine who's an art patron in the San Francisco area. And she said, I know who bought those chairs. It is an amazing gallery owner who today is 92 years old. She was one of the first New York gallery owners. She bought the chairs on behalf of a Vietnamese artist that was in her gallery. That artist is Jan Vo. Through connections, I was able to email Jan, speak with Jan, and Jan has become an incredibly close friend of our families. He grew up in Vietnam. He was born in 1975. His family was part of the boat exodus. They almost drowned in their boat. They were picked up by a Danish freighter, and they became Danes and grew up in Denmark. And Jan is now an amazing, globally recognized artist and sculptor. The chairs were purchased and he disassembled them. So the chair that you're sitting in right now has a cushion, it has strings, it's got wood. He completely disassembled them and made art pieces from them. And I've seen some of those. And I realized that that's exactly where the chairs needed to be, in the public domain. So you and me and Vietnamese can recognize that in these two chairs, two public servants sat and made decisions that forever changed the lives of millions and millions of people. The story goes a little deeper because Jan came to the farm. As we started to remove our old walnut trees, we bought a sawmill, and our son Sean has been sawing the timber into usable pieces that we ship in containers to Germany, where Jan now lives, and he makes world-renowned sculptures from our wood. So there is a legacy in the tragedy of Vietnam right here on our farm. So I just wanted to share that with you. And I'm so looking forward to our conversation, and just at this point want to thank you so much for inviting me to be with you today.
Thank you so much, Craig. That's really moving. And I'm so grateful that you're here today and for this opportunity to have this conversation. So yeah, I think this is a terrific time to open it up to questions and for discussion.
Ken, I see your hand up.
Yeah, great. That was very insightful, very, very personal. I haven't had the opportunity yet to read your book, and maybe it's in there, so forgive me if this is an obvious answer already been published. But clearly, I grew up at the same time, as you say, and just up the river in McLean, Virginia. And my dad was as a hardcore, and granddad were hardcore communists and pacifists, really, really, really in the anti-war camp, as deeply entrenched as you can be. And of course, your father's name was dirt around the family when I was growing up, because by the time I was sentient and aware, it was late stage Vietnam War, and we know what that was like. And it was kind of abstract to me as a younger boy, but very real. But since then, I'm reflecting through that period. One of the things, and my dad focused on this, and one of the things I've noticed is this inability of let's face it, men to admit they're wrong, right? And I'm wondering, knowing your dad, how much he felt of that, and I think we all do, right? It's something we all get. We don't want to admit publicly to a mistake because it's so freaking embarrassing, and your friends will think less of you. Very, very important stuff. So you said your dad knew he was wrong. And obviously, many of the people did, but a lot of people didn't. And I'm just curious where that stubbornness of I must continue doing what I'm doing just because I started doing it, even though he knew he was wrong, whether he still felt that and was doing it anyway because he couldn't back down as a man in this country.
Oh, what a profound question, and an important one, and one I can't answer, but I can try to think about it. And I can think about the end of life. My father carried this haunting shadow with him his entire life. And to get back to the point of admission that you're wrong, I think we realize today that they were so much better off doing that. Why carry around the burden of our wrongdoing until we die? I mean, I held my father's hand at his death, and he said that he felt that God had abandoned him. And my natural reaction was, no, Dad, God has not abandoned you. He's letting you go. And I pause now to realize maybe I should have said, well, why do you feel that way? And I assume that he felt that way because of his Vietnam experiences. And it would have been an opportunity at the last moment to maybe have him recognize that and pass and let that go. But that was 2009, and he left office in 1968. So I'm not answering your question, but
I think it's still true. And I think one of the things that we as a group are fighting against constantly is the sort of inertia of policy, wrong policy.
Right.
And I'm wondering if there's any insights where, knowing the individuals, you can talk to them in a way that makes it easier for them to back down and change policy. Obviously, with the entire war machine of the country running, it's really difficult.
Right.
But for something more local, stuff you've been engaged in, ag practices, or whatever local climate stuff, the same thing happens, right? People are stubborn, people won't admit they're wrong. That's why we're so polarized. That's what this group is fighting against, is that polarization, the stubbornness.
I remember early on I mentioned the 11 lessons. So let me share with you 3 that resonate with me, and pause to think. These were published in his memoir in 1994. So that's many years after his service, still early in his career to have changed, to do exactly what you're saying. So the first one that is something that we all believe in, and that is empathize with your enemy. And he goes on to say, a major conflict, the Cuban Missile Crisis, was diverted through an understanding of the enemy's intentions, while the Vietnam War is sad proof that blind miscomprehension leads to irreparable destruction. Number 3, there's something beyond oneself. As members of society born into a global community, we have a responsibility to one another and not only to ourselves. I think, Kate, that seems to be at the core of your mission, your group's mission here. Number 9 is a difficult one, and I'd be interested what you think about it. It's very hard for me. In order to do good, you may have to engage in evil. And he says opposing forces are the building blocks of existence. We cannot shy away from the evil required on our path to the greater good. And number 11 is you can't change human nature. In McNamara's mind, war is a natural facet of the human experience. And he says, I'm not so naive or simplistic to believe that we can end all war. So my thought on those 11 lessons is, obviously, you've learned them since the time that you were Secretary of Defense. So in 1994, what are you doing to act on these lessons? I'm not sure he did enough. Don, I see that you had a question.
Craig, I think that your book is, I have read it, and I've been really have a wonderful time. I just finished Samantha Power's The Education of an Idealist, and I'm right now reading John Meacham's And There Was Light, and I think both of them have something to say about the necessity of evil for a purpose that is drawn from what you shared. You have a unique vantage, and you've exercised a commitment, a responsibility to share your experience. One of the anecdotes that you raised is in your book was interacting with others who of your generation in the same sorts of circles that you were in, and so many of them didn't have a wonderful experience as they went through life. And that's one thing I would be interested in hearing from you. But the other one that I'm interested in is the process that you followed in producing this work, Was sometimes you read about writers spending 6 hours a day, getting up at 3 a.m, going to bed at 10 and getting up again and writing. I'm not sure if I'm expressing this in a good way, but would you like to comment on others of your circle and their life trajectories, and anything you can share about your process of producing this work?
Thanks, Don. That's a wonderful one. And it does circle back to the time that I had in Palo Alto, and specifically to the generosity of Sarah Frisch, who was my first kind of in-house coach. And beautifully, her life became too complex, her teaching, and she handed me off to a former student of hers, Jack Martinez, who grew up in Montana. At the time, I think Jack was 27 years old. And I don't think I could have done this without Jack, because Jack actually came from Montana, spent time here on the farm. As you may see in my book stand here, I've been a journaler all my life, and I have binders and binders of journals. He read through all those journals in order to really help me unpack this journey. And then he served as an amazing editor. So I was incredibly fortunate early on to find an agent, and I never knew it goes from an agent to an editor. So I had an agent, and that was recommended to me by a friend. So friendships are so important, back to fertigation. And within a short time, my agent, had found an editor at Little Brown. And Vanessa Mobley was my editor for a year and a half. And she said, when the draft came to her, she said, this is 80% done. Our job together is to continue to develop this book. And just pausing here for a second to fill in what you asked about other writers. I've shared this journey with other writers, and a dear friend of mine is Rose Styron. Rose is now 92 or 93. She's a lovely poet. She's the wife of William Styron, one of the great American writers. And she said, Craig, you are so lucky to have had a mentor who was engaged in the process. So I think that's the takeaway for me, Don. Alex Palmerly, you are far away. It's so nice to see you. And you did not grow up during this time.
Did not, no, not at all. But there are unfortunate parallels to today, obviously. Craig, I'll take the opportunity to ask you a question, and I think it's relevant. I think in my experience, we see that we've talked about men and how they have a hard time admitting when they're wrong, and
how
yes I was wrong, you're right. So my question is, I feel like men often have a hard time following in the footsteps of their fathers, right? They either try to do everything they can to outdo their father, either earning more than their father or bettering their father. And I feel like sometimes that comes in the sense of sort of righting the wrongs of their father. In other words, so my question to you is, do you feel like you have baggage that, because you've done amazing things, you're an organic farmer, you've started a nonprofit for agricultural education. How much of your father's legacy do you feel as a burden, and how much of his history do you think he felt as a burden?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. It's nice to hear that from you. And it's such an important thought, because I think your train of thinking is absolutely correct. And, I'm not a person who has felt, I'm not a person where shame has been a large part of my upbringing. And yet I have experienced shame during this journey. And I think you're onto a point. A lot of my life has been lived in an attempt to find the peace in the war that my father was the architect of for a significant part of that journey. So yes, I I think farming is certainly an outgrowth of my trying to find peace. Not that farming is peaceful, it's not. But having friends like you and people in Winters who are dedicated to, at this point, really addressing directly our changed climate. There is no change, there's no climate change, it's change.
Right.
And on that point, interestingly enough, in the research that I did here, I found written essays by my father in the 90s about climate change. He was concerned about climate change at that point. Now, that's not the earliest adapter, but it's interesting that he would have that. So there are, you pointed to our reactions to our fathers. And women, daughters can also have we're in this together, but
except the majority of mass shooters are men. So there's certainly something to be said for a crisis of masculinity.
Now let me just I want to take James's question here in a second, but you bring up something that's really profound, and it's in my book in two cases. There were two opportunities when my father went to Havana, Cuba, to meet with Fidel Castro and Nikita Khrushchev's son to review for the first time in person what transpired on those 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when President Kennedy and Robert McNamara were at the White House feeling they would never see their families again. And my father went on to say for his entire career, that was the closest the world came to nuclear destruction. And so here he is going to Cuba in, I'm going to say 1994. And I said, Dad, I've grown up my entire life knowing of Fidel Castro. I've wanted to meet him. I would be honored to join you in this seminar. I can sit in the back row. I don't have to be a revolutionary. I don't have to be a radical. I don't have to say one word. He said, no, Greggy, I just don't think that's the right time, you know? And I kind of go, are you kidding me? This is the right time. That happened again when he was going to Hanoi a few years later to meet with General Giap. General Giap was my father's Vietnamese contemporary. He was the man hand-selected by Ho Chi Minh to lead the war against America. And when he died, Giap died, millions of Vietnamese came to celebrate his life. That didn't happen for Robert McNamara. So he met going there, and I said, this is a time when we can heal together. Didn't happen. James, you've had your hand up there.
Yes, thank you for being here. And I have not read your book yet, but I plan on reading it. Just hearing things and watching the video certainly brings back many emotional feelings from the 1960s. Just, well, for myself, the day I got a letter of acceptance to medical school the day after I got my 1A classification. So I was spared going to Vietnam. But well, if I could go on a bit, my question is, where's the money? One of my heroes is Smedley Butler, who my understanding is the most highly decorated soldier in the history of the United States, but yet most people have never heard of this hero. He grew up as a Quaker. He went through the war. He became anti-war, and he pointed out the people who profit from the war. Who was profiting from the Vietnam War? How much did that come into play for the Vietnam War? And subsequent, you know, when I was a kid, I used to be tough. I said, when Congress declares war, I'll join the Marines. Congress has never declared war in all these years, but yet we've been fighting like crazy. Where's the money?
I think that's first of all, remind me, Smedley, what was his last name?
Smedley Butler.
Butler, beauty.
And I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the book he wrote, but he talked about.
I'll look for that. Yeah.
War is a racket.
War is a racket. There you go. Thank you, Brian.
Well, just as a note that I hope that you do have a chance to read the book. I don't practice any organized religion, but if I did, it would be Quaker. I did from halfway through 5th grade through 9th grade. I went to Sidwell Friends School in Washington, D.C., and that resonated to me. So where's the money? When you look at the American War, the Vietnam War, Where's the money? Did we go there for aluminum? Did we go there for rubber? Did we go there for oil? What the hell were we doing? Did we just want a war machine? And I don't know. Can anybody answer that question?
A lot of contractors on lobbying groups in DC. There's a lot of money in armaments, and they influence congressional elections.
That would be my thought, because I don't think this war was fought over resources. You know, Middle Eastern wars are frequently fought over resources. Other questions, other thoughts? We're coming closer to the time that you need to regroup in your own meeting, but.
And Jill, I see you have your hand up.
Craig, it's a wonderful book. You really are a beautiful writer, and I thought it was there was some cosmic irony that having left Stanford to go south and eventually land in Chile and experience all of the lessons and so forth that you learned, you came back to Stanford to write this book and bring some closure, at least some closure, to this part of your journey. I'm wondering what you think about. I mean, we're in a very serious and escalating situation with Putin, with China, and so forth, and the threat of the use of nuclear weapons is very real again. Do you think your father's lessons are still are applicable now, and if so, how?
Incredibly applicable, but we're not following them. I mean, none of the 11 are we following. I think Jill, an interesting question would be, if Robert McNamara were alive, would he be following them? Would he be a Daniel Ellsberg? This is I had never thought of this, but would he take the steps that I know Daniel would take this Saturday? If there was a demonstration that Daniel believed in this Saturday, he'd be out on the front lines demonstrating. I'm not sure my father would be, and that pains me.
Yeah, I bet.
One of the things that I kept coming back to reading this book and hearing you speak today is it's again, I mean, it's the themes of loyalty and truth, and how do you go about doing what is right in the common good, and how do you decide what that is? And I'm wondering, I mean, since you've thought about this so deeply, if you have any insight for us as we engage with people on the local, state, and national level, and if where sometimes we have different opinions, and how should we consider the issues of loyalty and truth as we engage, and bring that increased understanding to our conversations in a way that can be fruitful for all parties in the conversation?
Well, Kate, thank you for that. I imagine we all share your same desire. I certainly do. And I imagine we all practice some of the same things. And the first thing is to listen. And that's a skill that we've lost because we have our own pods, we have our own cells that we speak to. I have it with my wife, I have it with our Winters friends. And it just, my neighbor down the way who clearly has different political views than I do, because his signs are very clear on his lawns at those times. I didn't know that he had read my book, and he said how moved he was by that. Wow, what a beginning conversation. We probably don't agree on 50%. Maybe we don't agree on 25%, but my goal should be to find out. I'm not going to change those 25 percentage points in his beliefs, I don't think, but maybe we could understand and reinforce the 75% so that we can really move forward to address, Alex, you mentioned that it's us, it's males who are causing the horrific massacres in this country. Why is that? What can you and I and the 26 of us do here today to, in our lifetimes, change that? We've got to. And I think we can. And it's, it's something that we all grew up with, which is love. We've got to have love for each other. And we don't. We hate each other. And I find myself being angry and impatient in ways that I've never been before. Now, it could be I'm an old white man, but I'm not going to accept that. That's not the way I want to carry on the rest of my old white man life. So I don't know if that helps you, Kate.
That's terrific. Thank you so much, Craig. I really, really appreciate you being here today and joining us for such an insightful conversation, and for writing this book, which I think is reaching a lot of people and making people think and feel a number of things that perhaps we hadn't before, hadn't thought about so deeply.
But it means so much to be here today. Just on that note, just so that you know, during the course of this, since May, these are the 300 letters, emails that have come to me, stories, pictures, handwritten notes from families that are in deep pain, people questioning, just like we are, why we did this, and how we're going to change our world. So thank you so much. And I'll look forward to seeing you at the Buda Creek Cafe.
Fantastic. Craig, thank you again. Really appreciate it.